The silence in the boardroom was heavy enough to choke on, louder than any shout I'd heard in 20 years of venture capital. $3 billion sat on the mahogany table between us. A merger that would define my career and secure the firm's legacy for another decade. But as the lawyers droned on about liability clauses and stock options, the only thing I could focus on was the woman sitting directly across from me. Layla didn't look at the papers. She looked at me. Her gaze was a physical weight, steady and unblinking, cutting through the sterile air of the negotiation. The danger wasn't in the deal falling apart. It was in the terrifying realization that I wanted to burn the contracts just to see what she would do if the rules disappeared. I knew better. I was the one who wrote the rules. But looking at her, I felt the first terrifying fracture in a lifetime of control. Control isn't just a strategy for me. It's an architecture built with the same calculated risk and zero tolerance for emotional error that defines my portfolio at Sterling Hale. As the architect behind our most successful exits, I wear my reputation like armor, changing the temperature of a room just by sitting down, and I certainly don't let external consultants rattle me. Then Layla walked in. It was supposed to be a routine audit. The acquiring firm wanted a third-party stress test on our valuation of a tech unicorn we were about to fold into the merger. Standard procedure. Annoying, but standard. I expected a gray suit, a receding hairline, and a spreadsheet mentality that I could dismantle in 10 minutes. Instead, the door opened, and the air in the conference room seemed to shift, charged with a sudden, static electricity. Layla didn't glide. She marched. She wore a sharp, emerald green suit that defied the unspoken navy and black dress code of our world, and her hair was cut in a way that exposed the strong, elegant line of her neck. She didn't apologize for being 5 minutes late. She simply set her tablet down on the glass table with a deliberate click that sounded like a gunshot in a library. "Your valuation is optimistic," she said before she even sat down. Her voice was low, textured with a cadence that wasn't from here, a rhythm that suggested she moved to a different internal metronome than the frantic pace of this city. I remember leaning back in my chair, crossing my arms. This was my turf. "Optimism is for amateurs," I replied, my voice cool, practiced. "Our valuation is based on projected market share and IP assets." "Your IP assets are solid," Layla countered, finally looking up from her screen to lock eyes with me. "But your market share projections assume a stability that doesn't exist. You're betting on a straight line. The market is a curve." It was the way she said it, not aggressive, but unflinching. Most consultants stammer when I push back. They qualify their statements, they hedge. Layla didn't hedge. She held my gaze, her dark eyes intelligent and challenging, stripping away the hierarchy I relied on. She wasn't looking at the senior partner. She was looking at the logic and, by extension, the mind behind it. The friction was immediate and infuriatingly intellectual. We spent the next hour sparring over algorithms and user retention rates. Every time I parried with a statistic, she countered with a behavioral trend I hadn't factored in. It was a dance, sharp and dangerous. I found myself leaning forward, the exhaustion of the merger negotiations fading into a sharp, adrenaline-fueled focus. I hated that she was making valid points. I hated even more that I was enjoying it. There was a moment, halfway through the meeting, where the argument lulled. The room was quiet, save for the hum of the server banks down the hall. Layla reached for her water glass, and I watched her hand, fingers long, devoid of jewelry, movements precise. She took a sip, and as she lowered the glass, her eyes caught mine over the rim. It wasn't a professional look. It lingered a second too long, a beat of silence that felt heavy, loaded with a subtext I couldn't read but felt in my chest. My guard, usually impenetrable, felt a hairline fracture form. I dismissed challengers daily. I crushed competitors before lunch. But this woman, with her emerald suit and her infuriatingly correct math, stuck in my mind like a complex algorithm I couldn't solve. "We'll review your adjustments," I said finally, signaling the end of the meeting. I needed her out of the room. The air was too thick, too scented with her particular brand of disruption. "I'll be here all week," Layla said, standing up. She didn't smile, but the corner of her mouth twitched, a micro-expression that felt like a secret shared only with me. "I look forward to it, Amara." She used my first name. No title. Just Amara. As the door clicked shut behind her, I stayed seated, staring at the empty chair. The room felt colder without her, but my skin was burning. I told myself it was just the stress of the deal. I told myself she was just a problem to be solved, a variable to be managed. But as I gathered my files, my hands weren't quite steady. The merger was the priority, the only thing that mattered. Yet, for the first time in 10 years, I wasn't thinking about the closing price. I was thinking about the curve of a stranger's neck and the dangerous promise of a challenge I hadn't authorized. The audit had begun, but I had a sinking feeling that the books weren't the only thing being examined. I didn't walk into Sterling Hale to make friends, and I certainly didn't walk in to be charmed by the furniture. I came from a world where you didn't inherit a seat at the table. You built the chair yourself, usually out of scrap wood and sheer will, while everyone else was already on their second course. This audit wasn't just a job. It was the kind of high-visibility scalping that could catapult my consultancy from promising boutique to industry essential. I needed to find the cracks in Amara's perfect valuation, not because I wanted to destroy the deal, but because proving I could see what she missed was the only currency that mattered in this zip code. But by 11 p.m. on the third night, the currency was rapidly devaluing against the sheer, exhausting reality of the work. The office was a glass cage suspended in the dark, the city lights of London blurring into a meaningless grid of amber and white below us. The cleaners had come and gone hours ago, their vacuums a distant hum that had long since faded, leaving us in a silence so profound I could hear the hum of the hard drives and the rhythm of Amara's breathing. We were trapped in the orbit of the financial model, projected onto the wall and glowing on the tablets between us. The proximity was forced, a byproduct of needing to review 3,000 lines of code side by side. I sat to her right, close enough that the sterile, recycled air of the HVAC system was replaced by her scent. It wasn't the cloying perfume I expected from a woman who wore four-figure blazers. It was subtle. Expensive black tea, old paper, and something sharper, like cedar. It was distracting in a way that made the numbers swim if I looked at them too long. I watched her out of the periphery of my vision. The Iron Lady facade she wore like armor during the day had developed hairline fractures under the weight of the hour. She had taken off her glasses, rubbing the bridge of her nose with a weary frustration that made her look younger, less like a monument and more like a woman who was tired of holding up the sky. "You know," she said, her voice dropping an octave, losing the boardroom polish, "if you find one more error in the EBITDA projection, I might have to throw you out the window, and we're on the 42nd floor." I paused, my stylus hovering over the screen. It was dry, unexpected humor. I looked at her, and for the first time, she offered a small, tired smile. It wasn't a shark's grin. It was an admission of shared misery. "If you throw me out," I countered, keeping my voice level, "you'll have to finish the reconciliation yourself, and we both know you hate the grunt work." "Valid point," she murmured, leaning back. "You're safe, for now." The shift in the room was palpable. The professional antagonism softened into a strange, synchronized rhythm. We were two predators agreeing to a truce because the night was long. I reached over to grab the carafe of water, and at the exact same moment, she reached for her tablet. It was a collision of millimeters. The back of my hand brushed against her fingers. The reaction was immediate and disproportionate. It wasn't just static electricity from the carpet. It was a jolt that traveled up my arm and settled heavy in my chest. I pulled back, perhaps a fraction of a second too quickly. Amara didn't move her hand. She froze, her gaze snapping to mine. For a heartbeat, the financial model didn't exist. There was only the sudden, suffocating awareness of her skin, the heat radiating from her, and the terrifying realization that the tension I'd been reading as professional rivalry was actually a frequency I hadn't let myself tune into. I looked at her, really looked at her, and felt a wave of cognitive dissonance. She represented the establishment I was trying to break into. The gatekeeper, the legacy, the rule maker. I was the disruptor, the woman who had to be twice as sharp to get half the credit. I should have resented her. I should have kept my guard up. But looking at the way her dark hair fell against her collarbone, all I wanted to do was cross the distance between our chairs. "We should wrap up," Amara said, her voice tight, breaking the spell. But she didn't stand up. She stayed there, watching me, her eyes dark and unreadable. "Yeah," I said, my voice sounding foreign to my own ears. "We should." Neither of us moved. The work was finished, the laptops were closed, but the air between us was heavy, charged with the kinetic energy of a conversation we were both too coward to start and too hungry to end. We sat in the silence of the 42nd floor, the city burning below us, fully aware that the real danger wasn't in the spreadsheet anymore. Zurich is a city designed for secrets. It is clean, efficient, and quiet, a place where money moves in silence and the architecture feels designed to absorb sound. We were there to close the deal, a final 48 hours of negotiation in a neutral territory that cost 3,000 francs a night. The boardroom battles were over. The lawyers were drafting the final schedules in a conference room downstairs. For the first time in weeks, the pressure valve should have released. But as I sat in the hotel bar, watching the reflection of the fireplace dance in my glass of whiskey, the tension hadn't dissipated. It had simply changed state, condensing into something heavier, darker, and infinitely more volatile. The bar was a study in shadows and velvet, the kind of place where conversations happen in hushed tones, and the clink of ice against crystal sounds like a bell. I was exhausted. Not the physical fatigue of a long flight, but a bone-deep weariness that comes from holding up a persona for too long. The architect was tired of building. I wanted to burn something down. Layla slid onto the stool next to me. She wasn't wearing the sharp suits she wore in London. She wore a silk blouse the color of midnight, the fabric draping in a way that hinted at the movement beneath it rather than restricting it. In the low amber light, the sharp angles of her face softened. She looked less like an auditor and more like the only real thing in a room full of replicas. "You look like you're plotting a murder," she said, her voice cutting through the low hum of jazz. "Or an acquisition. With you, it's hard to tell the difference." I swirled the liquid in my glass, watching the vortex. "Maybe I'm just tired of the game, Layla, just for tonight." "The game doesn't stop just because you're in a different time zone," she countered, signaling the bartender for a gin and tonic. "But you can pause it." We stopped talking about the merger. We stopped talking about valuations, risk assessments, and the board's expectations. The conversation drifted into dangerous territory, the kind of vulnerability that usually requires a contract to protect. I told her about the silence of my house, the way the accolades on my shelf felt like paperweights holding down nothing. I admitted that the control I prized was just a way to ensure I never had to rely on anyone who could leave. Layla didn't offer platitudes. She didn't tell me I was successful or admired. She just listened, her body angled toward mine, her dark eyes absorbing the truth I never spoke aloud. "You built a fortress, Amara," she said softly, her hand resting on the marble counter, inches from mine. "It's impressive, but it must be lonely in the tower." "It's safe," I whispered. "Safety has a price. So does isolation." The air between us thickened, charged with the same static that had sparked in the conference room, but here, stripped of the fluorescent lights and the corporate armor, it was suffocating. I looked at her hand. Her fingers were long, capable. I thought about the way she handled the data, with precision, with care. I wondered how she would handle me. The decision wasn't sudden. It was a slow, deliberate surrender. I moved my hand, sliding it across the cool marble until my fingers brushed hers. She didn't pull away. Instead, she turned her hand over, interlacing her fingers with mine. Her skin was warm, a shocking contrast to the cold glass I'd been holding. The contact was electric, a current grounding me and setting me on fire all at once. It was a breach of every protocol I had written, a conflict of interest so flagrant it could end my career, and I didn't care. "Amara," she breathed, my name sounding like a prayer and a warning. "I know," I said. "I know." We finished our drinks in a silence that screamed. The walk to the elevators felt like walking underwater. Slow, heavy, inevitable. The hallway to the suites was empty, a long stretch of plush carpet and closed doors. When the elevator dinged and the doors slid shut, sealing us in the mirrored box, the world outside ceased to exist. I didn't wait for the room. I couldn't. I turned to her, and the control I had curated for 20 years shattered. I pressed her back against the paneled wall, my hands finding the silk of her blouse, the warmth of her waist. Layla made a sound, a low, desperate noise in her throat, and her hands were in my hair, pulling me down. The kiss wasn't tentative, it was a collision. It was urgent, stifled, a release of weeks of coiled tension that had nowhere else to go. She tasted of gin and defiance. Her mouth was hot, demanding, mapping the contours of my desire with a terrifying accuracy. I had spent a lifetime negotiating deals, calculating outcomes, ensuring I always had the upper hand. But here, in the suspended gravity of a rising elevator, I had no leverage, and I didn't want it. I wanted this. I wanted her. The elevator chimed at my floor, the sound jarring and bright. We broke apart, breathless, lips swollen, eyes wide with the realization of what we had just done. The doors slid open. I reached for her hand again, pulling her into the hallway. The door to my suite clicked shut behind us, locking out the merger, the board, and the rules, leaving us alone in the dark with nothing but the truth we could no longer deny. The morning light in Zurich was unforgiving. It sliced through the gap in the heavy velvet curtains, a sharp, white line that bisected the room and landed on the scatter of clothes near the door. My silk blouse was a pool of dark ink against the pale carpet. Amara's blazer lay draped over a chair like a discarded shield. Waking up in that bed, amidst the high thread count silence of a luxury suite, felt like waking up inside the eye of a hurricane. The calm was absolute, but the destruction, waiting outside the door, was catastrophic. I turned my head. Amara was asleep, her face pressed into the pillow, one arm thrown out as if reaching for something that wasn't there. Stripped of the boardroom armor, she looked terrifyingly human. The architect was just a woman with dark hair spread across white linen. breathing softly. The panic hit me then. A cold, sharp spike of adrenaline. This wasn't just a lapse in judgment. This was a professional death sentence. Conflict of interest, ethical violation, compromised audit. The terms cycled through my head, each one a potential headline that could torch the reputation I'd spent 10 years building from scratch. When she woke, the shift was instantaneous. Her eyes opened, and for a second, they were soft, unguarded. Then the memory of the night flooded in, and I watched the walls go back up. She sat up, pulling the sheet with her, the intimacy of the night before retreating into the corners of the room. "We can't do this," she said, her voice rough with sleep but steady. She didn't look at me. She looked at the window. "I know," I answered, sitting up, the cold air of the room hitting my skin. "The deal." "Until the papers are signed?" she said, turning to face me. Her gaze was intense, pleading and commanding all at once. "We are strictly professional. No one can know. If the board smells even a hint of bias, the merger collapses. And so do we." We accepted the suffocating weight of the secret right there over lukewarm room service coffee. We drafted the rules of engagement like a treaty. No touching, no lingering looks, no digital trails. We were constructing a glass house in the middle of a war zone, convincing ourselves the transparency would hide us. Back in London, the secret didn't feel like a cage. It felt like a power source. The office was the same, crisp, sterile, humming with the low-grade anxiety of high finance. But everything had changed. Every interaction was layered with a subtext only we could read. I would sit in a strategy meeting, watching Amara dismantle a junior associate's risk assessment with surgical precision, her voice cool and detached. To everyone else, she was the terrifying senior partner. To me, she was the woman who had whispered my name in the dark of a Swiss elevator. The cognitive dissonance was intoxicating. I would watch her hands, those elegant, capable hands, gesturing at a projection screen, and a phantom memory of her touch would ghost over my skin, raising goosebumps under my blazer. It was a thrill, sharp and dangerous. We communicated in code. A meeting request titled Q3 Projections Review meant she needed 5 minutes to breathe in the same room as me. A forwarded email with no text meant she was thinking about me. I knew I should pull back. The audit was nearing completion. I had enough data to write my report and leave. But I couldn't stop. I found reasons to visit the 42nd floor. I invented questions about legacy assets just to watch her verify them. I was addicted to the vertigo, the dizzying drop between the public lie and the private truth. We thought we were containing the fire, keeping it sealed behind the glass walls of our professionalism. We didn't realize the heat was already warping the frame. The discrepancy appeared on a Tuesday, buried deep in row 402 of the due diligence ledger. It was a rounding error in a subsidiary's tax filing, a microscopic fissure in the bedrock of a $3 billion deal. Under normal circumstances, I would have caught it in my sleep. I would have flagged it, dissected it, and used it as leverage to shave $50 million off the acquisition price. But I hadn't been sleeping. I had been awake, replaying the way Layla's breath hitched when I touched her waist in the elevator, the ghost of her sensation overriding the cold logic of the spreadsheet. The board meeting that followed was brutal. The chairman, a man whose silence was more terrifying than his shouting, tapped the glass table with a single manicured finger. "Amara, this oversight is unlike you. Is there a distraction we should be aware of?" The question hung in the air like a guillotine blade waiting to drop. My heart hammered against my ribs, a traitor in my own chest, loud enough that I feared the microphone in the center of the table would pick it up. "No distraction," I lied, my voice steady. though my palms were damp against the leather of my notebook. Just a complex data set. We're scrubbing it now. Paranoia is a cold, exhausting companion. It changes the way you see the world. Suddenly, the glass walls of my office weren't a symbol of transparency. They were a display case. Every glance from a junior associate felt like an accusation. Every time Layla walked into a room to deliver a report, I felt the collective gaze of the office shift. Were they looking at her work? Or were they looking at the way my eyes followed her, tracking her movement like a compass needle seeking north? I found myself checking the blinds, locking my phone, clearing my browser history like a teenager. The architect was becoming a fugitive in her own tower. The slip happened in the most mundane way possible, which made it all the more terrifying. We were in the break room, neutral ground, or so I thought. It was 7 a.m., the office empty save for the hum of the cleaning crew on the lower floors. I was making espresso, she was getting tea. I reached for the sugar packet at the exact moment she did. My hand covered hers. It was instinct, pure, unthinking muscle memory to weave my fingers through hers, to squeeze, to steal a single second of contact in the fluorescent purgatory of the kitchenette. Amara, she whispered, leaning in, the scent of cedar and rain closing the distance. Morning, a voice boomed from the doorway. Marcus, the head of compliance. I snatched my hand back as if I'd touched a hot stove, spinning around to face the machine. The espresso cup rattled violently against the saucer, the china chiming like an alarm bell. Marcus didn't say anything about the hands. He just smiled, that shark-like grin that never reached his eyes. Early start, ladies. Diligence never sleeps, right? He knew, or he suspected. The way his eyes darted between us, assessing the flushed skin on Layla's neck and the rigid, unnatural tension in my shoulders, he was cataloging the atmosphere, filing it away for future leverage. Later that afternoon, the internal conflict boiled over. I sat in my office, staring at the skyline, the gray London clouds mirroring the storm in my head. Was I really risking a 20-year legacy for this? For late-night whispers? For the intoxicating friction of her mind against mine? I was Amara Hale. I was the firm. This was supposed to be a fling, a release valve for the pressure of the merger. But looking at the empty chair where she usually sat, the thought of ending it felt like cutting off a limb. I wasn't afraid of losing the deal anymore. I was afraid of returning to the cold, perfect silence I had lived in before her. Then came the defense. We were in a strategy session. Marcus threw Layla's latest report onto the mahogany table with a dismissive thud. This consultant is overstepping. He sneered, loosening his tie. She's digging into personal accounts of the subsidiary's CEO. It's aggressive. It's going to spook the target. We should cut her loose before she tanks the deal. The rage that flared in me was white hot and immediate. It wasn't professional annoyance. It was a primal, protective instinct that bypassed my brain entirely. She is doing the job we hired her to do, Marcus, I snapped, my voice louder than intended, cutting through the room. She found the tax discrepancy you missed. If she's aggressive, it's because this firm has been asleep at the wheel. She stays. The room went dead silent. I never raised my voice. I never defended consultants. Marcus looked at me, eyebrows raised in mock surprise. Touched a nerve, Amara. That was the moment. The realization hit me with the force of a physical blow. I wasn't just sleeping with Layla. I respected her. I admired her. And God help me, I needed her. The real threat wasn't the board finding out. It was the fact that I was willing to burn the firm down just to keep her. I was in love with the disruptor, and that love was a liability I couldn't hedge against. The leak in the ledger was nothing compared to the leak in my heart, and I knew, with terrifying clarity, that the dam was about to break. The external threat to the deal had just become a direct threat to the only thing I actually wanted to keep. The gala was a minefield, disguised as a celebration. The chandeliers at the Savoy dripped crystal like frozen tears, casting a fractured, glittering light over the sharks circling the buffet. This was the deal closing gala, a premature victory lap for the merger Amara was orchestrating, and the room smelled of expensive perfume, stale champagne, and naked ambition. I stood on the periphery, holding a glass that had gone warm 10 minutes ago, watching the performance art of high finance. Every smile was calculated, every handshake was a contract. And at the center of the orbit, gravitational and blinding, was Amara. She wore black velvet, a column of darkness that absorbed the light around her. The neckline was severe, plunging just enough to hint at the skin I had mapped with my fingertips in Zurich. But here, under the harsh glare of the flashbulbs, she looked made of marble. She was charming the CEO of the acquiring firm, laughing at a joke that wasn't funny, her hand resting lightly on his forearm. It was a masterclass in soft power. To everyone else, she was the gracious host, the Iron Lady melting just enough to close the sale. To me, she was a torment. The torture wasn't just in the distance, it was in the erasure. I was Layla, the external consultant, a temporary fixture, a line item on the expense report. I had to nod politely when board members asked if I was enjoying the learning experience, biting my tongue to keep from saying I was the one teaching them how to read their own data. I had to pretend that the woman dominating the room hadn't whispered my name into the hollow of my throat 3 hours ago. This was the deal we made, the glass house, the invisible walls, but tonight, the glass felt like it was suffocating me. Then I saw her, a woman from a rival equity firm, tall, blonde, with a predatory grace, slid into Amara's circle. I knew her reputation. She was aggressive, brilliant, and rumor had it, Amara's ex from a lifetime ago. She leaned in close, whispering something that made Amara's polished smile falter into something genuine. She touched Amara's shoulder, a familiar, claiming gesture that sent a spike of jealousy through me so sharp it felt like a physical blow. The possessiveness flared, hot, and ugly. I wanted to walk across the room, shatter the crystal, and take her hand. I wanted to claim the space that was secretly mine, but I couldn't. I was the secret. I turned and walked out, the noise of the gala fading into a dull roar as I pushed through the heavy French doors onto the terrace. The London night was cold, damp with the threat of rain, but I needed the air. I gripped the stone balustrade, my knuckles white, trying to regulate the rhythm of my heart. "You're running away," a voice said from the shadows. I didn't turn around. I knew the cadence. "I'm getting air, Amara. There's a difference." She moved into the light, spilling from the ballroom, the velvet of her dress rustling softly. "You left just as the speeches were starting." "I don't need to hear them praise your discipline," I snapped, finally facing her. The anger was vibrating under my skin. "I saw the way she touched your arm. That easy, claiming familiarity you allowed in front of everyone while I stood 10 feet away and played the ghost." "Layla," she warned, stepping closer, checking the windows for onlookers. "Keep your voice down." "Why? Are you afraid they'll find out the consultant has a pulse?" I pushed off the railing, invading her space. "I watched you in there. You erase us so easily. It's effortless for you." "Effortless?" Amara let out a harsh, incredulous laugh. She closed the distance, her composure cracking. "You think this is effortless? I am terrified, Layla. Every minute I'm in there, I'm terrified I'm going to look at you and give it all away. I'm not afraid of losing the job. I can get another job. I'm afraid of the fallout destroying you. The admission hung in the cold air. She wasn't protecting her legacy. She was protecting me from the blast radius. She reached out, her hand hovering near my face, trembling slightly. I have never wanted anyone enough to risk everything, she whispered, her eyes dark and searching. Until you. The vulnerability broke me. The anger dissolved into a desperate, aching need. We were in the shadows of a pillar, hidden from the direct line of sight of the ballroom, but still dangerously exposed. I didn't care. I reached for her, my hand tangling in the velvet at her waist, pulling her flush against me. The risk spiked the desire to a fever pitch. We were standing on the edge of a cliff, and the vertigo was intoxicating. I kissed her, hard and deep, a claiming that erased the gala, the ex, and the lies. For a second, she melted into me, her guard dropping, her mouth soft and yielding. It was a stolen moment of absolute truth in a night of performance. Then the heavy door creaked. We broke apart instantly, stepping back into the shadows just as a waiter stepped onto the terrace with a tray of empty glasses. He looked around, his eyes sweeping over the dark corner where we stood breathless and trembling. He paused, frowning, then turned and went back inside. The door clicked shut. We stared at each other, the adrenaline crashing through our systems. It was too close. The secret had almost survived the night, but we both knew the architecture was failing. The glass was beginning to crack. The summons to the chairman's office arrived with the morning coffee, delivered by an assistant who wouldn't meet my eyes. In the ecosystem of Sterling Hale, silence is the loudest alarm, and the hallway leading to the executive suite was deafeningly quiet. I walked it with my spine straight, the Iron Lady persona fully deployed, but my hands were cold. The terrace door, the waiter, the secret had leaked, not as a deluge, but as a toxic drip that had finally reached the foundation. Arthur sat behind a desk that cost more than my first house. He didn't offer me a seat. He slid a thin manila folder across the polished wood. It stopped exactly at the edge, a precipice waiting for me to look over. "There are rumors, Amara," Arthur said, his voice mild, which was how I knew I was in danger. "About your objectivity, about the consultant." He didn't say affair. He didn't say scandal. He used the corporate euphemism that was far harder to fight, bias. "Layla's work has been impeccable," I said, my voice steady, though my heart was hammering a frantic rhythm against my ribs. "She found the tax liability. She saved us millions." "And yet," Arthur countered, leaning back, "the board feels her influence is becoming undue. We cannot afford a merger of this magnitude to be tainted by the perception of favoritism. The deal is fragile. If the shareholders smell a personal conflict, the stock tanks. You know the math." I did know the math. It was a binary equation. Remove the variable, save the equation, keep the variable, crash the system. "What are you asking, Arthur?" "I'm not asking. I'm telling you to terminate her contract today, before the final signatures on Friday." He paused, his gaze sharpening. "Or we will have to review your position as managing partner." The choice was laid out like an autopsy. I could burn my career to defend a secret, or I could cut the limb to save the body. If I fought, the investigation would turn personal. They would dig until they found the hotel receipts and elevator footage, branding Layla as the consultant who slept her way into a deal. I would survive the scandal. She would be destroyed. The couldn't leave instinct kicked in, twisted and painful. To save her from the wolves, I had to be the one to hold the knife. "I'll handle it," I said. The words tasted like ash, Walking back to my office felt like marching to an execution. I called Layla in. She entered with a small private smile, the kind that used to make the fluorescent lights feel like sunshine. When she saw my face, the smile died. She didn't sit down. "Close the door," I said. "Amara?" "The board has raised concerns regarding the optics of our collaboration," I began, retreating behind the desk, using the furniture as a barricade against the hurt I was about to inflict. "They believe your presence is a liability to the closing." "A liability?" Layla repeated, the word sounding foreign. I found the error. I did the work. "It's not about the work. It's about the deal." I picked up a pen, focusing on the tip so I wouldn't have to look at her eyes. "I am terminating your contract, effective immediately. You'll be paid in full, of course, plus a severance for the abruptness." The silence that followed was worse than the shouting I expected. It sucked the air out of the room. I waited for her to argue, to scream, to demand I fight for us. "You're protecting the merger," she said finally, her voice terrifyingly calm. "I'm protecting the firm," I lied. "No," Layla said, stepping closer to the desk. She placed her hands on the glass surface, leaning in until I was forced to look at her. Her eyes were dry, but the disappointment in them was a physical weight. "You're protecting yourself. You're choosing the safety of your tower over the risk of being real." "Layla, please. I get it, Amara. The architect doesn't do messy. And feelings are messy." She straightened up, smoothing her blazer with a dignity that made me feel small. "You can keep your severance, and you can keep your secret. I won't be the one to burn you down." She turned and walked out. She didn't slam the door. She closed it with a soft, final click that echoed like a gunshot in the empty room. The withdrawal was immediate. The office, usually my sanctuary, became a vacuum. The scent of cedar and rain was gone, replaced by the sterile smell of ozone and fear. I sat there for hours, staring at the skyline, feeling the phantom warmth of her hand in mine, knowing I had just severed the only connection that had ever made me feel alive. 2 days later, the deal closed. The champagne popped. The partners applauded. I shook hands, signed papers, and smiled for the cameras. The victory was absolute. My legacy was secure. But as I stood by the window watching the city lights blur in the rain, the success felt hollow, a golden cage I had locked myself inside. I had won the merger, but I had lost the only thing that had any value. I didn't go home to cry. I went to a co-working space in Shoreditch, rented a hot desk in the corner, and billed 3 weeks of work in 3 days for a fintech startup that didn't know how lucky they were to get me. That's the thing about being the disruptor. You don't get to pause. If you stop moving, the concrete sets around your ankles. I threw myself into valuations, burying the memory of Amara's office under layers of code and projected revenue streams. I tried to suture the wound with exhaustion, treating my schedule like a defensive perimeter, hoping that if I made my eyes hurt enough from staring at screens, I wouldn't see the ghost of her silhouette against the Zurich skyline. But silence is a persistent auditor. It finds the discrepancies. 2 weeks out, the anger began to cool into a dull, heavy ache that sat in the center of my chest like a stone. The city felt gray, stripped of the electric current that had run through it when I was the secret behind the throne. I walked past Sterling Hale's tower on my way to a client meeting, craning my neck to count up to the 42nd floor. From the pavement, the building looked like a fortress, impenetrable, cold, magnificent. Standing there in the drizzle, watching the clouds reflect off the glass, I started to see the logic in what she did. She was the architect. She reinforced the structure when the load became too heavy. She cut me loose to save me from being crushed by the debris of a scandal. It was a kindness wrapped in cruelty, a strategic amputation to save the patient. But knowing the logic didn't stop the ghost of her scent, cedar and rain, from catching me off guard. The living room was perfectly ordered and perfectly cold. I landed a massive contract on Friday, the kind that should have called for expensive champagne and a victory lap. Instead, I sat there with a lukewarm tea, the silence pressing against my ears. I realized that the ambition I had nursed for a decade felt hollow. The victory meant nothing because I couldn't tell the one person who would understand the math behind it. I didn't just miss the lover, I missed the peer. I missed the friction. The couldn't stop part of the equation finally outweighed the pride. I wasn't built for safety, I was built for the curve, for the risk. I knew where she went on Sunday mornings. It was a detail she'd dropped once, a throwaway line during a late night in the office about a specific coffee shop in Marylebone that served the only decent espresso in London because the barista hated everyone equally. It was a gamble. She might not be there. She might be there and refuse to look at me. But the void was louder than the fear. It was raining, a soft, miserable London drizzle that slicked the pavement and turned the world into a watercolor painting. I saw her through the window first. She was sitting in the back, away from the door, a financial newspaper spread out but unread on the table. She looked smaller without the armor of the boardroom table between us. She wore a soft gray sweater, her hair tied back loosely, strands escaping to frame her face. She looked like a civilian. She looked like a ruin of herself, beautiful and devastated. I walked in, the bell above the door chimed, a sharp sound that cut through the low murmur of the shop. Her head snapped up. The shock on her face was unguarded, raw, her eyes widening as if she were seeing a ghost. I didn't give myself time to retreat. I walked straight to her table, my boots heavy on the wood floor, and stood there, dripping wet, holding my ground. "Is this seat taken?" I asked, my voice steady despite the hammering in my chest that threatened to drown out the espresso machine. "Or is it reserved for the board?" Amara stared at me, her mouth parting slightly, the newspaper crinkling under her grip. "Layla, I'm not here for an apology, Amara, and I'm not here for a job." I sat down without waiting for permission, invading the sanctuary she had built. The proximity hit me instantly, the scent of her, familiar and grounding, cutting through the smell of roasted beans and wet wool. "I'm here because the math doesn't work." She closed the newspaper, her fingers trembling slightly as she pushed it aside. "The deal closed," she said, her voice low, lacking the command I was used to. "You're safe. Your reputation is intact. I made sure of it." "I don't care about the reputation," I said, leaning in, lowering my voice to that intimate frequency we had invented in the dark of the elevator. "I care about the variable we deleted. You think you saved me, Amara? You just exiled me to a safe, boring world where no one challenges me. I'd rather burn with you than be safe alone." Amara looked at me, really looked at me, and for the first time in weeks, I saw the Iron Lady facade finally crumble into dust. The rules of the game we had been playing, the secrecy, the hierarchy, the fear of the fall, suddenly felt obsolete. We weren't in the office anymore. The glass walls were gone. It was just us, and the truth was the only currency left on the table. Layla's words didn't just challenge me, they dismantled the entire foundation I stood on. Sitting there, in her wet coat, defying the cold logic of self-preservation, she made the safety I clung to look like a coffin. I looked at the unread newspaper on the table, the headlines about the merger, the stock prices, the world I ruled, and then I looked at her hands, clenched into fists on the scratched wood. The choice wasn't binary anymore. It wasn't career or love. It was life or a slow, suffocating death by protocol. The math was wrong, I said, my voice cutting through the clatter of the espresso machine and the murmur of the Sunday crowd. I calculated the risk of losing the deal. I didn't calculate the cost of winning it. I didn't check the room for spies. I didn't scan the perimeter for board members or clients. For the first time in 20 years, I simply didn't care who was watching. I reached across the table, covering her clenched hand with mine. Her skin was cold from the London rain, damp and trembling, but the moment our palms touched, the connection was instantaneous, a grounding wire snapping into place. She didn't pull away. She exhaled, a long, shuddering breath that seemed to carry the weight of the last 2 weeks with it, her shoulders dropping as the fight left her. "I'm not going back to the tower, Layla," I whispered, holding her gaze, letting her see the cracks in the armor I had finally stopped trying to repair. "Not without you. If we burn together." The resolution wasn't a quiet retreat. It was a hostile takeover of my own life. That Monday, I walked into the chairman's office without an appointment. I didn't resign. The architect doesn't surrender. I sat down and disclosed the relationship formally. I told Arthur that my personal life was no longer a variable he could manage. I put my track record on one side of the scale and their archaic expectations on the other, and I dared them to cut me loose. I watched the realization hit him that he couldn't afford to lose the revenue I generated just to uphold a moral clause from the last century. It was the most satisfying negotiation of my career. They didn't blink. Profit, it turns out, is the only morality Sterling Hale truly understands. There were new protocols, of course, recusal forms, strict Chinese walls between our departments, but I kept my seat, and more importantly, I kept her. The reunion wasn't a frantic collision like the elevator in Zurich. It was a slow, deliberate weaving of lives. It happened in the quiet spaces. Keys placed on a shared counter, coffees that didn't need to be hidden behind closed doors, the feeling of her back against my chest as we slept. The secret I couldn't keep became the truth I lived in. We navigated the new reality with a transparency that felt radical. We don't work on the same deals anymore, but we strategize over dinner, debating market trends with the same intellectual friction that sparked this fire. Only now, the arguments end with laughter and wine instead of withdrawal and silence. I look at her across our living room now. The apartment is filled with the scent of her cedar tea and the jazz records she insists on playing. The Iron Lady armor is hanging in the closet, collecting dust. Here, in the soft light of a Sunday evening, I am just Amara. The coiled tension that defined my existence, the fear of the slip, the paranoia of the glance, is gone. It has been replaced by a steady, enduring hum of connection, a frequency that drowns out the noise of the city below. Layla looks up from her book, catching me staring. She smiles, that private, unguarded smile that belongs only to me. "You're analyzing again," she teases, her voice warm, intimate. "I'm reevaluating," I correct her, moving to sit beside her on the sofa. I take her hand, interlacing our fingers, resting them openly on her knee. "I used to think control was the only asset that mattered. I was wrong." "Oh," she raises an eyebrow, leaning into my touch, her thumb brushing my knuckles. "And what's the new valuation?" "This," I say, kissing her hand. "The risk was the best investment I ever made." We found a way to balance the hunger of ambition with the sustenance of affection. We proved that you don't have to be hollow to be powerful. The merger of lives is complete. And for the first time, the future isn't a projection on a spreadsheet. It's the woman sitting next to me, holding my hand in the light. The glass walls of my office no longer feel like a cage, but a frame for the life we chose to build on our own terms. We stopped hiding the desire and started living the truth. If you've ever risked it all for a connection that defied the logic of your world, subscribe to follow more stories of high-stakes love. The deal is signed, but this time, the terms are finally ours.